This is Kenny Tan. Welcome to Real Estate License in 14 Weeks. This is episode 4 of Starting from Zero. Non-freehold estate. We'll continue to talk about leasehold estate today. If you have not watched episode 3, please do so before you watch episode 4. It will be more clearer to you and it's easier to understand episode 4 once you have watched episode 3. We're going to talk about discrimination. There are 2 agencies that regulate discrimination in the state of California. One is the Housing, Urban, and Development. 2 is the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Well, there are many different kinds of trades that are protected by the law. For example, sexual orientation, religion, ethnic background, disability, size of the family are just some of the protected trades. Department of Fair Employment and Housing. For exam purposes, I always advise my students to remember the short form, which is DFEH. And then for HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, that is the United States Housing and Urban Development. For short, we remember that one as HUD. As a landlord, it is not a fun thing to be investigated by either of these agencies. Now, both agencies actually police against discrimination by landlord. So if you're a tenant, you have been discriminated by a landlord, you can either complain to one of these agencies. An example of discrimination might be that if an applicant who is inflicted with coronavirus and he comes in for an interview with the landlord found out that he is inflicted with coronavirus and rejected his application on that basis. A person who is inflicted with coronavirus is a disabled person or could be a disabled person. So if that person is discriminated, that person can file a complaint with the DFEH or HUD. When HUD receives a complaint like that, HUD usually will conduct some sort of discrimination investigation against the landlord. And typically they will gather information from the landlord. They will get the names of all the tenants that the landlord has in a particular building, their names and addresses, terms of the lease, application. There's a lot of paperwork that have to be provided to this agency. So if you're a landlord, you don't want to be investigated for discrimination. Another type of discrimination will be, for example, if a tenant has some sort of disability and makes a request to the landlord to accommodate that disability. And if the landlord refuses to accommodate that disability by allowing the tenant to have a companion dog. You know, sometimes a tenant might suffer some kind of psychological problem that a physician might allow that or might encourage that patient to have a companion dog to help in the healing. In this case, the landlord cannot discriminate against the disabled person by not allowing that tenant to have a pet, for example. Next, we're going to talk about repair. As a landlord has an obligation to keep the property in good repair conditions. That is to make sure that the property is habitable. That is required by law. For example, a landlord cannot put in the lease agreement that it is the tenant's responsibility to repair the roof because a leaky roof is a condition that makes the property uninhabitable. It is against public policy for the landlord to require the tenant to keep the property in habitable condition. I'll give you an example of an exam question that if you understand the principle that I just described earlier, you'll be able to get the correct answer. Which of the following conditions, if exists, would allow the tenant to withhold rent from the landlord, i.e., the property is uninhabitable, because that is the only time that the tenant can withhold rent from the landlord. So number 1 in the answer choice is cracked driveway. Number 2, yellow lawn, that means the grass is dying. Number 3, a clogged garbage disposer, it's not working. Number 4, leaky roof. In this case, the correct answer is leaky roof. And why is that? Because a cracked driveway, a yellow lawn, or a clogged garbage disposer does not make the house uninhabitable, whereas a leaky roof, like in a rainy day, will make the house uninhabitable. So correct answer is leaky roof. So now you have it. Now what are some of the typical conditions that's required by law for a property to have in order for it to be considered habitable? For example, a property needs to have hot and cold water, needs to have heat, no AC is required, and then the stairways need to have railing, and the property cannot have exposed wire, no rodents, no vermins. These are just some of the requirements of the law. Next, we're going to talk about quiet enjoyment and possession. What is quiet enjoyment and possession? All that means is that a landlord cannot do certain things to interfere with the peaceful possession of the tenant. For example, number 1, a landlord cannot enter the property without the consent of the tenant, except in emergency. What are some of the things that could be considered emergency? For example, you have a broken water pipe that needs to be stopped immediately. That's an emergency. Number 2, about quiet enjoyment is that a landlord cannot cut off utilities just because a tenant doesn't pay rent, and a landlord cannot lock a tenant out. That will be an interference with the quiet enjoyment. Also, a landlord cannot make unnecessary or unwarranted repairs. What are some of the things that a landlord would want to do? For example, a landlord may want to remodel the kitchen in anticipation that the property will be put on the market after the tenant leaves. Is that something that is necessary? No, not in terms of the law. The landlord can wait until the tenant has moved out to remodel the kitchen to get ready to sell the property. So that's not necessary. And lastly, a landlord cannot make unnecessary noise to harass the tenant. So these are the 4 things that the tenant are protected against. And if the landlord violates any of these 4 things, that will be an interference with quiet enjoyment and possession of the tenant. If a tenant has a landlord that will not make any repairs, even after multiple requests have been made to the landlord, what recourse does a tenant have? Well, the tenant have 5 things that they can do. Number 1, a tenant can withhold rent from the landlord until the deficiencies are corrected. For example, if you have a leaky roof, you notify the landlord. Landlord doesn't want to do anything. So in this case, that we have a property that is uninhabitable, so the tenant is justified in withholding the rent. And number 2, pay for the repairs for the leaky roof and then sue the landlord in a small claims court, for example. Number 3 is to complain to the housing authority. So the last thing that a landlord wants is to have a housing authority personnel come to the property to check the leaky roof and then give the landlord a citation. When that happens, it is a very difficult situation for the landlord. Number 4, the tenant essentially can abandon the premises, basically just pack and leave, and then the lease is considered canceled under the doctrine of constructive eviction. Constructive eviction is just a legal term that describes a situation where the tenant is justified in moving out of the property in response to the landlord's repeated failure to make necessary repairs to keep the property in habitable condition. And lastly, number 5, what the tenant can do is the tenant can make repairs to the leaky roof and then deduct the expense for the repair to the leaky roof from the next month's rent. Now, if the tenant wants to use number 5 as a way to resolve the problem with the landlord not making repairs, the maximum amount that the tenant can deduct in a 12-month period is 1 month's rent. For example, if the monthly rent is $1,000, the first time that an uninhabitable condition happens, the landlord doesn't do anything. For example, it's a leaky roof. The tenant spent $500 to fix the leaky roof. So on the next month, the tenant deducted the $500 from the $1,000 by paying $500 in the rent for the next month. So the next thing that could happen, for example, might be that the property has rodents or pests, and the tenant spends another $500, so that makes it $1,000. So once that $1,000, 1 month's rent had been met, the tenant cannot do it the third time because the maximum has been reached. Or it's in any given 12 months period, maximum of 1 month's rent, and twice a year. There you have it. This is the end of episode 4. If you like my video, please click like. If you want to receive future notification of my video, please subscribe and remember to click bell.